And to be clear, this won't be an either-or situation. It's not auto layout or a stack view. We're still going to need to do manual auto layout work. We just won't need to do as much as we used to. I'm going to sound like a bit of an Apple evangelist here, but this is one of those rare controls that is both incredibly simple and incredibly powerful. Simple in that I can introduce it in just a few words. The stack view takes two or more views and stacks them either vertically or horizontally. That's it. That's what it does. That's all it does. But there are a few things to understand, a few concepts here to make the most of it. Number one, a stack view is transparent. It has no appearance of its own, not even a background color. There's no grid lines, no visible boundaries. It's a control designed to arrange other controls. It is in itself invisible. Two, it is either horizontal or vertical. It's basically either one row or one column. You choose the axis when you're making one. You stack a bunch of things vertically or a bunch of things horizontally. Now, this would be very limiting if you could only use one stack view at a time, but these things are designed to be nested, to use multiple stack views together. Group 3 items in one vertical stack view and 5 items in another, and 10 items in another, and then stack those all together in a horizontal stack view. Now, this is not just theoretically supported. It's kind of the whole idea. It's what you're meant to do with them. Now, once you've chosen your axis, either horizontal or vertical, there are 3 other settings you'll commonly use. Each stack view has its own set of properties for alignment, distribution, and spacing. So with alignment, if you are going to stack several controls vertically, whether those are labels, buttons, images, they may well have different sizes. So within the stack view, you could choose to align them to the left or leading edge, the center, the trailing edge. There's also the notion of using the fill alignment, which will try and increase the widths of your views to fill the available space. Now, it's true your views may have their own internal alignment. Maybe a label, for example, could be center aligned or right aligned or left aligned, but you're affecting how these align with each other. If it's a horizontal stack view, you have exactly the same idea. We also have the idea of distribution, how the control should be distributed across whatever axis, whether it's vertical or horizontal. This can be a bit more tricky to get your head around, particularly if the views inside that stack view have their own different sizes. So across a horizontal stack, for example, fill equally will attempt to adjust each view so they have the same width, whereas options like equal spacing won't adjust the widths but will try and make the same spacing, whereas equal centering doesn't care about the spacing. It tries to distribute the center points of each view equally. As you can imagine, the key with the distribution property is really just experimenting to see which one looks best. And finally, there is a spacing property, an easy way to make sure that there either is or isn't a minimum amount of blank space between the view objects inside any one stack view. This is the kind of thing that before would often take lots of small, fiddly auto layout constraints or transparent views to get right, but it's very easy to do in a stack view. Now, talking of auto layout, I said we still need it, just a lot less. And with stack views, one of the most important things we now need auto layout for is to control the stack view itself within our view controller. So if we've positioned one on our storyboard, we don't need manually added auto layout constraints within the stack view a lot of the time, but we will use auto layout constraints to position the stack view itself on our storyboard. So let's take a look at this. I have a demo project with some views on a storyboard. Right now, there is no manual auto layout going on here. If I look at the document outline, there are no constraints. So it's just a few controls dragged and dropped and loosely arranged on this view controller. But back to the problem. When I run this, I'm going to lose a lot of content, particularly off the right-hand side, because it's using those default left-oriented auto layout constraints. So we've seen how to fix this with manual constraints. Let's see how to fix it with a stack view. When working with these, you can use the object library and you will find entries for both the horizontal stack view and the vertical stack view. You can drag them onto the storyboard and then drag controls inside them. But it's very common to first roughly arrange some controls and then add a stack view around them. So the first one I'm going to add is going to be for the 3 controls at the top, 2 buttons and a label. I'll hit Command-click to select all 3. Then come down to the lower right of the storyboard, and the first icon here that says Stack, when I mouse over it, will embed these in a stack view. I click that. It's looking a little small. We'll fix this in a minute. If you don't like the icons at the bottom, you can also get to this same option through the Editor menu. Editor, Embed in Stack View. Because these controls were originally positioned horizontally, Xcode will make a guess that I probably want a horizontal stack view for them, which is true. If it had guessed wrongly, I could open up the Attributes Inspector and change the axis on that stack view. Xcode does add a slight background color to it, and this is just to indicate that we have a stack view. When you run this, you won't see the background color. But I'd like this stack view itself to fill the available width. And this is where setting up auto layout constraints is still essential. I want to constrain this stack view to the left and the right margins and to the top layout guide. So I want to select the stack view. I might be tempted just to click somewhere in it, but selecting a stack view can be tricky because when I now click this area of the storyboard, there are multiple view objects wherever I'm clicking. One option we can do is to select it in the document outline. You'll see the stack view there, and you can also see the nesting that's going on right now, the buttons and the label inside the stack view, inside the view controller. But here's another great shortcut key. If when I click on the storyboard, I hold the Shift and Control keys down before clicking, then I'll get a pop-up that shows every object in the storyboard under that exact position from the top down in hierarchy. Can read from the bottom up. I clicked a label that's inside a stack view, that's inside a view, that's inside the view controller. I want the stack view to select that, so I'll click there. I've got the entire stack view selected. I can now add constraints for them. Now, the best option that I find for adding constraints to a stack view, rather than doing the control drag to the edges, is instead using the pin menu at the bottom of the screen, the third icon here. The reason I prefer this is that you're often trying to constrain a stack view to multiple margins at the same time, and very often with a gap of 0, so it's very easy to add several at the same time here. I would like to constrain this to the left margin with 0, to the top with 0, and to the right. Well, right now it says 271 because that's based on its smaller size. I'm going to change that to 0, and double checking that, I'll click the button at the bottom that says Add 3 Constraints. I can see that the stack view itself is taking up that available space, although the things inside it are not exactly the way I'd like them to be arranged. So I'll open up my Attributes Inspector for the stack view, which should still be selected, and I'm going to change its distribution options. I might check a couple of them, like Fill Equally. That doesn't look very good. I'm going to come down to Equal Centering. That's the kind of look that I was going for here. As a little sidebar, one thing that I notice quite a bit in this version of Xcode is when you add a stack view, you'll often see the exclamation mark telling you that there are some errors, some issues with the frames here. Sometimes I think this is not quite genuine. If I, for example, select the stack view itself and then make a tiny change to it and change it back, like I go to the size inspector and change its X position from 20 to 19 and back, all those issues go away. So I think there's a bit of a mismatch going on. Hopefully that will be fixed in a future version of Xcode. And one thing that can be very useful is when you surround things in a stack view, you can make a bit of a mistake for them. So you want to know, how do you take them out of a stack view? Well, you can just click and drag them out, or you can cut and paste. But the easiest way, if you're working with a stack view, is that you'd select the stack view in the document outline or by Control-Shift clicking, and then go to the Editor menu, and you have the option to unembed. You can also get that option from the button at the bottom with that selected, but you have to hit the Option key first, and then you'll get this option to unembed. But I'm not done yet. I want to make a couple more. I'm going to take the right headline and the right subheading here and embed those in a stack view. That should create a vertical stack view for me. It's made them a little close for my liking, so I'm going to open up the Attributes Inspector, and with that stack view selected, increase the spacing a little bit. And while I want to set up some constraints for this section, before I do, I'm going to turn this one into another stack view. I'm going to combine this with the image on the left-hand side and embed this stack view with the image into another stack view. And this is so I can demonstrate that nesting idea, that this is what they're intended to do. Open up the document outline, we can start to see how these things are embedded inside each other. We have a vertical stack view with the headline and the subheading. That's embedded with the square inside a horizontal stack view. However, I'd like to constrain this horizontal stack view to the left and the right edges like the one above it. So making sure the stack view itself, the entire one, is selected. I'll come down again to the pin menu. It's going to suggest some constraints here that it's 8 points from the stack view above it. That looks okay. And then 0 margins on the left. I also want 0 margins on the right. So I'll click that little red line, hit 0, add 3 constraints. Again, I've got this slight error, the orange guideline showing me there's a bit of a warning with issues here. If I go over to my size inspector, go from 20 to 19 and back, the warnings go away. I'm going to test this. I'm going to select an iPhone 6, middle of the road iPhone here, Command R, and it's looking pretty good. We have these correctly aligned ones at the top. We have the right headline and the subheading. Of course, I want to switch to landscape. That's looking pretty good as well, and switch back. So it does seem to be working. What I do want to do, though, is go ahead and show this running on a smaller one like the iPhone 4S. Command R. And it's doing its best to collapse these things down, but we're running into that issue that large font for the headline is just a little bit too big. And what a stack view won't solve is one of the inherent problems of designing for a mobile platform with both large and small available screen sizes. That's really the problem of trying to fit 10 pounds of potatoes into a 5-pound bag. Sometimes things just can't be done where a smaller screen or different orientation needs to be customized, because this single design, however smart and however many constraints you put on it, sometimes just won't work across every device and orientation. So while stack views are fantastic, and you're going to find them usable on pretty much every iOS application you make, there are certain things that don't need them. If you're creating, say, a table view inside a navigation controller, you don't need a stack view for a classic table view. But if you were designing a custom cell for that table view, then a stack view is absolutely a great choice to manage that layout. But in the next clip, we're going to talk about the situation of how we make even more adjustments to a user interface when we're going across different devices. When it comes to creating adaptive layouts, auto layout and stack views are not our only tools. We also have a technique called size classes, and these allow us to make significant changes when shifting from one screen size to another. It's really easy to think, but isn't that what we've been doing with auto layout? Well, with auto layout, we do small changes. We set up our constraints so that when we go to a specific portrait orientation, the toolbar can resize. If we shift to landscape mode, then that toolbar can expand and a button can go along with it if it needs to. And sometimes auto layout is enough. But size classes allow us to make more substantial changes, so that when we shift from portrait to landscape mode, the font should change from 24 points to 12, or an image should reduce by 75%, or maybe this toolbar shouldn't even show up in landscape mode at all. And we can do this without writing any code. It's all done visually in the storyboard. Now, I want to reiterate that these techniques are not mutually exclusive. Quite the opposite. It's not auto layout or size classes. It's both. They accomplish different results, and it's always auto layout first and size classes later. When we use the phrase size class here, the word class does not mean a Swift class. This is not about code. In this context, class means category or type or kind of size. What device type are we running on? Because when our app runs, it could be running on anything from the very small iPhone 4S to the very large iPad Pro. But again, we don't want to concern ourselves with the details of any specific device. What we want to know, as generically as possible, is are we running on a smaller screen or a larger screen? What size category device are we running on? Do we have a good amount of space or do we not? And to do this, we only need two size classes. There are just two words to describe this idea. The first size class is regular, and the second size class is compact. That's it. Not small and large, or portrait or landscape, or iPad or iPhone, just regular and compact. But, and this is an important but, with the size class, this category description, this word regular or compact is applied independently to both the height and the width of whatever device is being used, meaning every single device has a width size class and a height size class. So, an example. If your app is running on an iPad, any iPad, an iPad mini, an iPad Air, an iPad Pro, and running in portrait, it is considered to have the size class of a regular height and a regular width. Now, an iPad running in landscape is also considered to have the size classes of regular height and regular width. And what that means is if you need to make a distinction between different kinds of iPads, size classes are not a method to do so. It's always regular height and regular width. But let's focus on iPhones. I'm going to go through some examples, but don't stress too much about remembering the exact details. As you'll see very shortly, you won't need to remember all of them. This information I'm about to tell you will always be at your fingertips when you're in Xcode. When you're using an iPhone, any iPhone in portrait mode, this is considered to be the size classes of regular height and compact width. Even the smallest iPhone that can run IOS9, the iPhone 4S, running in portrait mode is regular height, compact width. That might sound a little counterintuitive. After all, if it's the smallest iPhone, if it isn't a compact height, what would be a compact height? Well, the reason that the screen is considered regular height in portrait is that it's good and scrollable. You could still manage large amounts of content. Even on a small iPhone, you can easily scroll up and down to read long emails or view long web pages. But here's where things change. If you turn that iPhone to landscape mode, it is now considered to have a compact height and a compact width. So let me repeat that. All iPhones in portrait mode are regular height and compact width. You turn those iPhones to landscape, it's compact height and compact width, not regular width. Now, the reason for this distinction is that when you're holding the device in landscape mode, then scrolling left to right is clunky from a user perspective. It's not manageable. It's not like scrolling up and down when it's in portrait mode. It's generally more difficult to deal with larger amounts of content in landscape orientation, so it is considered compact width as well as a compact height. Now, the one exception to this are the iPhone Plus devices, the iPhone 6 Plus and the 6S Plus, because when those are held in landscape mode, they are considered compact height but regular width. And that's because it is more realistic to read larger amounts of content on the Plus devices in landscape orientation because the resolution is good and the screen is larger. Understanding the available size classes allows us to customize our storyboard just for a particular size class. To be able to say, well, when my app is running on a compact width, I want to make this change. Or if it's a compact height, I want to make this different change. And the question you may be wondering at this point is, well, what size class are we designing for by default? A great question, and the answer is none of them. A default storyboard does not restrict us to a particular size class, and nor should we want it to. When we're designing, it defaults to a size class of any height and any width. So when we're talking about size classes, we don't just have the idea of compact and regular, we have either, and that's the default. Now, any is not an actual size class, it's the lack of a size class. It's what happens when you don't choose one. But because that is an option, that means the grid, the matrix of the available devices is quite wide. Now, the great thing is you don't have to remember this because it's always at your fingertips. Here's what I mean. Over to Xcode in a storyboard, there is an area at the bottom that currently is set to W any, H any, width any, height any. This is clickable, and it will pop up the grid of size classes, and this is how you can shift between different size classes in your storyboard. If you mouse over these, it will remind you that in the middle here, this is any base values. It works for all layouts. If I go up to the top left corner, this is for compact width and compact height, and it reminds me at the bottom, this is for the 3.5, 4, and 4.7 inch iPhones in landscape. As I mouse over, it'll tell me exactly what different devices fall into the different categories. Now also notice the green dots as I'm mousing around here. These show you which size classes would be affected by your choice. For example, if I mouse over the middle, the default any, I see green dots everywhere. That means if I design in any, my choices affect everything, every device. But if I mouse over, say, the top middle one, which means if I make a change for anything with a compact height, I'll see that it affects iPhones in landscape. That includes the 5.5 inch iPhones, the Plus iPhones. It includes the smaller iPhones. If I choose the one in the middle, the green dots show me what this affects. So when we want to make a change for a specific size class, you just click the option. I want to make a change for compact width, compact height. I mouse over the top left and I click it. Now notice that the bar at the bottom becomes blue to alert us that whatever we're doing right now is just for a specific size class layout. Also notice that the canvas size here is shifted as well. If I click the bar again and shift down to the compact width and regular height, which is all iPhones and portrait, you'll see another shift of the canvas. It looks a little bit more like a generic iPhone here. I'm going to switch back into the middle option of any, the one we should be used to, the square layout. And keep in mind that we will do everything we possibly can in the any height and any width mode. We will only shift to make changes for a particular size class if it's proven that we need to, and then we will shift back to generic any mode as soon as we can. So what can we change when we shift? What can be different? Well, there are 4 things you can make changes to between the size classes. You can change a font or a font size for a specific size class to generic any mode as soon as we can. So what can we change when we shift? What can be different? Well, there are 4 things you can make changes to between the size classes. You can change a font or a font size for a specific size class, and that includes changing what's shown on a label or a button. You can change auto layout constraints between size classes, having different sets of rules. You can even delete or add constraints just for a specific size class. You can effectively change the position or the size of a view. But probably most significant, and where the most substantial changes are possible, is that you can add or remove a view object from the view hierarchy just for that size class, meaning that you can have some objects show up for one size class but not show in another. That's what allows us to make the biggest changes, and that's what we'll see next. To demonstrate size classes, I've built a very basic user interface. I'm using a couple of stack views here, and I've already added auto layout to this. So if I go ahead and run this on an iPhone 6 in portrait mode, it looks okay. Everything's being squeezed in. I've got enough constraints here and using the stack views so I can see all of my content. But if I go ahead and test this on a much smaller screen with the iPhone 4S, not so much. In portrait mode, I lose some of the content. Things are squeezing. They're looking pretty ugly. If I change to landscape mode, I lose a lot of it. Most of my content here is being obscured by either the headlines, the image, or the toolbars. So even though I've done auto layout, it's not enough here. So in landscape mode on smaller devices, what I want to do is have a smaller font on the headline and the subheadline. I want to apply different constraints to the image, that red square, so it's automatically smaller. And I want to remove the toolbar and the tab bar so I can focus on the text when I'm viewing it in this format. So let's do that. Now, it's worth pointing out that manipulating size classes is not something you do early on in your user interface design. It's kind of the last thing that you do. You want to have all your user interfaces complete as possible and have done all your auto layout work, or at least as much as possible there, before you start messing with size classes. And worth mentioning that before you start any of this, save a backup copy. Size classes are great, but if you mess up, and you probably will when you're learning how to use them, it's quite tedious to reset everything. So I've been doing most of my work in the mode of any down here. If I click that, what I'd like to do is make a change to the smaller iPhones in landscape, which means I'm going to come up to compact width and compact height. I'll verify at the bottom of this window. It tells me this is for the 3.5, 4-inch, and 4.7-inch iPhones in landscape. That's correct. And I click that, and we shift into that mode. Notice again the blue bar at the bottom. It's an alert that you are not in the normal mode. You're in a size class specific mode. And most of the changes you make here will only take effect on smaller iPhones in landscape mode. The first thing I'm going to do is change one of the fonts. So I select the right headline here and go to the attributes inspector for that. What I don't want to do is just change the font here straight down, because that will change it for everything. Notice the plus button. This is the clue that there's something that we can change on a per size class basis. If I click that plus button, I get a pop-up asking me what size class do I want to make a customization for. It's going to default to the one I'm currently in, which is compact width, compact height, and that is the one, though I could change to the others. So click that, and now I get a second layout for this, width compact, height compact, and I can change that. Let's take it down to, say, 24. This would be a good time to open up the preview assistant mode so I could take a look and see how this is going to apply to a smaller screen. Shift from automatic to preview. We're looking at the iPhone 4-inch, but again, the changes I'm making only apply in landscape right now. So click the button at the bottom, and we can see the impact of that. Flicking back to portrait, we have the regular heading size, but in landscape, we see the smaller heading size. I'll also go ahead and change the subheading here. Again, click the plus button for the font, compact width, compact height. Let's take that down. As I make the changes, you should see it in the preview mode as well. Now, in a moment, we'll probably need to do a little bit of adjusting to the constraints in there. Just make sure that the stack view is going to render everything correctly. It is possible to confuse auto layout when you're making these changes in a particular size class. The next thing I want to do is change the image. It's a little bit too big right now. It's going to the default size. I want to restrict it to perhaps 50 points by 50 points. Here's the easiest way to do that. I'm going to add 2 new constraints. And instead of control dragging between this image and something else, I'm just going to hit control, click on the image, and just kind of drag up to itself and let go. It's going to ask, did I want to do a height constraint? And yes, I did. I'll click that, and then I'll hit control, click the image, drag a little bit to the right, and let go. Select width. Now, what this has actually done is added 2 constraints here. I can see them right beside here. This hasn't changed the image at all because I need to make a change to the attributes inspector. 2 ways of getting to that. If I can grab the constraint on the storyboard, I can then change them here. If I can just grab hold of the image, I could go to the size inspector and I would see both of these constraints showing up. They're both right now set to 102. I'm going to hit edit, change that to 50 for the first one, hit edit on the second, and change it to 50 as well. So we're adding new constraints that will just take effect in this size class. Now, something I want to point out is if you're keeping an eye on the document outline right now, you'll see these constraints being added. So I've got a constraint of width of 50 and height of 50. I'm just going to flick back into the size class of any, because you're going to notice there that they will show up in the document outline, but they'll be grayed out. And that's telling us that these only take effect on a different size class. They don't take effect on any, but if we flip back into compact, they're going to turn on there. Now, the next thing that I want to do is actually get rid of the toolbar and the tab bar. I'm going to decide that when we're in landscape mode, these should not show up. If someone wants to use them, they just flip back into portrait mode. So I'm not deleting them from the application, just from this particular perspective of it. But what I don't want to do is just hit delete. That would not work very well at all. It's a special delete. I'm going to select here and hit Command Delete. The way you can tell this has worked is I can still see the entry for the toolbar in the document outline, but it too is grayed out here. Then I'm going to hit the tab bar, and again, Command Delete. It's still there. If I flick back to any, I can verify that those are still in my application, and they show up in their proper colors in the document outline, but back to compact, they are grayed out here. Back in compact mode, I'm getting an alert here that the text view isn't quite sure where it should position itself. That's because the constraints it had previously were based on the position of the toolbar and the tab bar, and they aren't there anymore, so it's a little more confused. So I'm going to reset those constraints. I'll actually just drag it down to the bottom and give it a bit more room. This text view is not part of a stack view, so I'm just going to set up suggested constraints just for this one. Looks like everything's gone blue. My document outline tells me there are no auto layout issues. So I'll go ahead and run this on the iPhone 4S. And in landscape mode, we've got the smaller image, we've got the smaller font, and we don't see the toolbars. If I flick to portrait mode, and sometimes I have to do it a couple of times to refresh the simulator, then we're getting everything back. Now, this still looks pretty ugly. I might want to go ahead and make similar changes in portrait mode for iPhones, but to prove the point of what we were doing there, we flick to landscape, we make all those size class specific changes, we flick back to portrait, and the original any setup is back. So with size classes, we can add and remove view objects. We can change fonts. We can add and remove and change constraints. An excellent way to adjust between devices without writing a lot of code to recreate and rebuild your user interface. Just make sure to always switch back to any. We have multiple technologies for building these adaptive layouts, and the stack view control, new in iOS 9, is a wonderful addition. Simple in concept, just vertical and horizontal stacks, but by using multiple stack views and options of alignment, distribution, and spacing, we can easily get user interface work done that would have been incredibly time-consuming in iOS 8. So much so that Apple themselves have talked about that they assume the stack view will be the go-to user interface control for most developers from now on, that you just naturally start with a stack view and go from there. And we explored size classes. This is the technique that allows us to make significant differences when shifting from one kind of screen size to another. There are only two size classes, regular and compact, although iOS devices use a size class for both the height and a separate one for the width of every screen. As a rule, we need to design as much of our user interface in the mode of any size class width, any size class height, and make a jump to a specific size class only to solve an issue that we know we have. And you can shift between size classes in the storyboard. There you can change the font, you can change auto layout constraints, or even add or remove objects in the view hierarchy just for that size class. We're going to get back to our imaginary Night Porter app and start tying a few things together, do some work with view hierarchies, use some auto layout options, add some additional